Excuse me, young lady. First class is for real passengers, not little girls trying to sneak in. The words hit harder than a shove. Sharp, cold, public, and loud enough for the entire front cabin to hear. Just like that. 12-year-old Leah Robinson stopped in her tracks, her left hand still gripping the strap of her brown leather backpack. She blinked once, confused, maybe even embarrassed, but not broken. The flight attendant, a white woman in her early 40s with a tight ponytail and a tighter frown, didn't bother to lower her voice or show even a hint of kindness. She stood with her arms crossed at the front of Ameriwest Airlines Flight 482, Gate B29 out of Newark Liberty Airport, blocking Leah from seat 2A, the one printed clearly on her boarding pass. Leah tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. Passengers around her looked up. Some furrowed their brows. Others just stared blankly, the way people do when they see something wrong but don't know if it's their place to speak. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country below. And if you believe dignity and justice matter, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Leah. She was dressed simply, a clean olive hoodie, dark jeans, sneakers that had clearly walked more than a few school hallways. Her hair was braided into neat rows, and her eyes were clear, focused, and steady. She didn't yell, she didn't argue. She just looked up and said, "Ma'am, this is my seat. 2A. My father booked it." Her voice was calm, the kind of calm that comes from knowing you've done nothing wrong, and knowing that might not be enough. The flight attendant didn't even glance at the boarding pass. "Do your parents work for the airline?" she asked, not out of curiosity, but suspicion. "No," Leah replied plainly. "My dad paid for it. He's meeting me in Charlotte." That's when the man in 2B, middle-aged, white, expensive watch, pressed slacks, leaned in and chuckled. Back in my day, kids like that didn't get handed first class. They earned it. His wife said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence said enough. Leah felt heat rush to her cheeks, but she didn't move. "Please," she said again, offering the boarding pass with both hands now. "I'm in 2A. The attendant finally took the ticket, glanced at it, frowned harder, and said, "This doesn't look right. You need to step aside until we verify this with the gate." Leah turned her body toward the aisle, stepping carefully out of the way, not because she accepted the treatment, but because she'd been raised to be respectful, even when others weren't. She stood near the galley wall, in full view of everyone, but treated like she wasn't even there. A white curtain hung halfway across the aisle, separating first class from economy, and for a moment, Leah felt like it was more than fabric. It was a message, a boundary. She looked at her hands, her fingers curled around the leather strap of her backpack again. Then, without a word, she reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and called the one person who could make sense of this. "Hi, Dad," she whispered when he picked up. "It's happening again." He didn't have to ask what it was. Leah had only used that phrase once before, 2 years ago, when a mall security guard accused her of stealing a water bottle that had been in her hand when she walked in. Her father had told her then, "You don't need to raise your voice to defend yourself. Your truth is louder than their assumptions." And now, she needed him again. "They made me leave my seat," she said. "They don't believe my ticket is real. I showed it. I did everything right." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Not the kind of pause that means someone doesn't know what to say, but the kind that means someone is about to act. "Where are you right now?" her father asked. "Still on the plane," Leah said. "I'm standing near the restroom. Everyone's watching. They won't let me sit." She swallowed hard. "I didn't cry," she added, almost as if she was checking in with herself. I just waited. Her father exhaled slowly. I'm 5 minutes from the gate. Don't move. I'll be there before that plane leaves the ground. Leah nodded, even though he couldn't see her. Okay, she whispered. I knew you'd answer. Then she hung up, slipped her phone back into her pocket, and stood a little straighter. She wasn't small, not anymore. A few rows behind her, a woman with silver hair, maybe in her 70s, leaned over to her seatmate and asked, Did you hear what that flight attendant said to that little girl? Her voice wasn't angry, it was stunned. She paid for that seat, the woman said. I saw her ticket. It was scanned. The seatmate shrugged. It's not our business. He mumbled, but it was. It should have been. And Leah knew that too. She reached into her bag again, this time pulling out a small notebook. The front was worn soft from being carried everywhere. She flipped to a blank page, uncapped her pen, and wrote, They took my seat, but they can't take my place. Her handwriting was clean, careful, the kind that comes from writing more often than texting, the kind that holds meaning, as she wrote. The curtain behind her rustled. Another flight attendant, a younger woman with warm eyes, peeked out from the back. Her name tag read, Cynthia Morales. She looked at Leah, then looked over at Tracy. Something passed between them. Not words, just recognition. Cynthia said nothing but didn't look away either. She knew something was wrong. And in that moment, so did everyone else. Tracy returned to the front of the cabin, speaking into her radio, still waiting on gate confirmation for a questionable boarding situation. Her tone was clinical, detached. Leah was now a situation, not a customer, not a child, but she wasn't alone anymore. Her father was on his way, and what none of them knew, not the woman with the crossed arms, not the man with the watch, not the pilot behind the locked cockpit door, was that this little girl from Coach wasn't just anybody. She was the daughter of the man who helped build the systems that kept their aircraft flying. And he was about to walk through that gate with the calm force of someone who had learned long ago that silence doesn't mean surrender, and that dignity doesn't need permission to sit down. Leah stood quietly by the galley wall, just beneath the glow of the no smoking sign, her backpack still on her shoulders and her notebook held loosely in one hand. The noise around her had softened, but the weight in the air was heavier than ever. Passengers whispered just loud enough for her to hear pieces of their doubts. Is she lost? Maybe she snuck up? Why didn't the flight crew just handle it already? But the one voice Leah clung to wasn't in that cabin. It was her father's, still echoing in her mind. I'm 5 minutes away. Don't move. She looked down at her feet, then back at her seat. 2A. Empty. Untouched. Like it was waiting for her to come home. And yet, no one moved to give it back. No apology. No explanation. Just silence and the sound of someone flipping a magazine 2 rows down like nothing unusual was happening. Tracy Bennett, the lead flight attendant, reappeared at the front of the cabin holding a small clipboard, talking to the gate agent, Tom Reynolds, through the half-open door. We're just double-checking the manifest, she said curtly, loud enough to sound official, not loud enough to sound concerned. Tom was uncomfortable. He could feel it in his chest. He had checked Leah's ticket himself 15 minutes earlier. Group 1, first class. Her passport matched. Everything was clean. But Tracy's tone had a way of turning doubt into process, as if protocol gave her the right to treat this little girl like a fraud. Her documents are fine, Tom said, trying to stay neutral. I scanned the ticket myself. Tracy sighed. She just doesn't look like our usual first-class profile. That's all I'm saying. He knew better than to argue further. "Whatever you need," he muttered, stepping back into the jet bridge. From her place in the galley, Leah heard it all. She heard how her body, her skin, her clothes, how all of it were being sized up against someone's idea of who deserved to sit in a leather seat at the front of a plane. It wasn't about security. It wasn't about policy. It was about perception. She squeezed the notebook tighter and took a slow breath through her nose. Across the aisle, Rachel Kim, seated in 2C, had been watching quietly. Her brow furrowed deeper each time Tracy dismissed the situation like Leah was a misplaced suitcase. She finally leaned toward the aisle and called gently, "Excuse me, can I ask something?" Tracy turned. "Yes, ma'am." "Why is that little girl still standing back there?" Rachel asked, keeping her voice even. "She was here when I boarded. She had a ticket. I saw it." Tracy stiffened. "We're verifying a few things." Rachel nodded once, but her expression didn't soften. "I just hope those things aren't about how she looks." Back in the rear cabin, Cynthia Morales stood by the beverage cart, frozen. She had seen plenty during her years flying: bad attitudes, impatient passengers, even heated arguments over peanuts. But something about the way Leah had been treated didn't feel like routine. It felt targeted, cold, and unjust. Cynthia reached for the crew intercom and spoke low into her mic. "Cynthia to lead. Is the first-class girl cleared or not?" There was a pause. Then Tracy's voice crackled back. "Still reviewing with gate. Stand by." Cynthia bit the inside of her cheek. She wasn't in charge, but she wasn't blind either. Near the front, Leah opened her notebook again and began to write, not because she needed to remember, but because she didn't want to forget. "They smiled when I boarded. They froze when I sat. They erased my name with their silence." She didn't look up as Gerald Whitman, still smug in 2B, leaned over to his wife and muttered, "It's not racism. It's just standards." His wife gave the smallest nod and turned her head away from Leah, as if her presence was somehow disruptive. Helen Brooks, seated in 3A, heard it all. The older woman shifted in her seat and narrowed her eyes. "You know," she said firmly, "when I was little, we had signs that told people where they could and couldn't sit. This feels no different." Gerald scoffed. "Oh, please, don't turn this into a movement," Helen replied without blinking. "Maybe if more people had the courage to speak up, we wouldn't need movements." Tracy didn't respond. She just adjusted her blazer and faced forward, pretending not to hear. Meanwhile, Leah's phone buzzed softly in her hoodie pocket. She pulled it out and saw the message. "Dad, almost there. Keep breathing. You're not alone." A slow, steady warmth rose in her chest. It wasn't relief. It was reassurance. A reminder that she wasn't crazy, she wasn't wrong, and she wasn't invisible. She looked up, eyes meeting Rachel's for a moment. Rachel gave her a soft nod. Not pity, not sympathy, just respect. And that, somehow, meant more than any apology could. Across the aisle, Helen leaned forward just slightly and whispered, "You don't need to say a word. Sweetheart, the way you're standing, that says everything." Leah blinked back the sting behind her eyes. She didn't want to cry. She wanted to remember. Then the curtain parted, and everything changed. The curtain slid open with a quick pull, and the moment it did, a new kind of silence spread through the cabin. Not the awkward stillness from before, but something deeper, expectant, like the pause before a storm. Leah turned her head slowly, notebook still in her hand, as Tracy Bennett stepped through the curtain and faced her directly. "We need you to come with us," she said coldly, motioning toward the jet bridge. "Your seat can't be confirmed at this time, and we can't delay this flight over a mix-up." Leah looked at her boarding pass one more time, then back at the woman, her voice still calm but firmer now. You scanned it? You saw it was valid? Why can't I sit down? Tracy didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her posture said everything. She had decided Leah was the problem, and nothing was going to shake that narrative. Just then, Gerald Whitman added his voice again, not even pretending to hide his smirk. Let's not hold up the plane. Put her in the back where she belongs. The words hung in the air like smoke. It was no longer passive. It was direct. Rachel Kim's mouth dropped open. That's enough, she snapped, her first real outburst since boarding. You don't speak to a child that way. Gerald shrugged, feigning innocence. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. Helen Brooks stood. At nearly 76 years old, her knees shook a little, but her voice didn't. You're wrong, she said clearly. Not everyone's thinking that. Only the ones who've decided a child's skin color disqualifies her from respect. Tracy turned to her. Ma'am, please take your seat. Helen didn't budge. I will. When she gets hers? A ripple of murmurs passed through the cabin, but no one interrupted. For a long second, Leah simply stood there, caught between the pressure to obey and the instinct to resist. She glanced again at her seat. 2A. So close, but unreachable. Then, almost without thinking, she took a single step forward. Tracy raised her hand. If you don't return to the terminal voluntarily, we'll have to involve security. She doesn't need security, Rachel said sharply. She needs a seat, one she already paid for. Tracy snapped back. You are not in charge of this aircraft. And from somewhere behind them, a voice cut through the chaos like a blade. But I am responsible for the contract that keeps these planes in the air. The entire cabin turned toward the jet bridge. A tall black man in a navy blue sport coat and pressed slacks walked in, his phone still in one hand, his airport badge visible on a lanyard. His name was Charles Robinson, CEO of Robinson Aerospace Systems, one of the top avionics providers for AmeriWest Airlines. And more importantly, he was Leah's father. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. He walked straight to his daughter, gently placed his hand on her shoulder, and said, You did everything right. I've got this now. Then he turned to Tracy. Why was my daughter removed from her seat? Tracy blinked. Sir, she couldn't provide sufficient verification. We were waiting on gate confirmation. The gate confirmed it, Charles said, without even checking his phone. The agent scanned her ticket, matched her ID, and seated her. Your problem isn't with her paperwork, it's with your perception. Gerald stood now, folding his arms. Who do you think you are? Charles looked him straight in the eye. The man who helps keep this aircraft flying. My company designs the systems your pilots use to land safely. But today, I'm just a father who watched his daughter get humiliated in front of a plane full of people because someone decided she didn't belong where she absolutely did. There was no shouting, no threat, just facts. Tracy faltered. We were only trying to follow protocol. Your protocol failed, Charles said calmly. You made her stand in public while you debated her worth. I will not let this plane leave until it's made right. From the flight deck, Captain Laura Sanders emerged, her face tense. Sir, I understand there's been a misunderstanding. This wasn't a misunderstanding, Charles replied. It was a decision, multiple decisions. Every time someone saw her, heard her speak, saw her documents, and still decided she wasn't good enough. He turned back to Leah, knelt slightly, and met her eyes. You didn't flinch. I'm proud of you. Leah blinked. I didn't cry, she said softly. I just stood still. He smiled gently. Sometimes that's louder than yelling. Then he stood and faced the crew. I'm invoking stop clearance. Your company knows the protocol. No takeoff until senior management is looped in. Cynthia Morales, watching from behind the drink cart, quietly stepped forward. She was treated unfairly, she said clearly, and she never raised her voice. Not once. The entire front cabin was silent now. Helen Brooks sat down slowly. Rachel leaned back in her seat, arms crossed. Gerald muttered something under his breath and looked away. Captain Sanders radioed the gate. Within 60 seconds, flight control called back. Hold boarding. Do not close the aircraft door. It was official. AmeriWest Flight 482 was grounded, not by weather, not by equipment, but by accountability. Tracy opened her mouth as if to object, then closed it again. There was nothing left to say. Charles looked down the aisle and said simply, "Let her take her seat." And this time, no one stopped Leah. She walked to 2A, the seat she'd been denied, the one she'd quietly fought for, and sat down, straight-backed, steady, unapologetic, and as she clicked her seatbelt into place, she opened her notebook and wrote 5 words, "My silence was not weakness." For a full minute after Leah sat down in seat 2A, the first-class cabin was silent. No announcements, no beverage service, no movement, just silence, thick and sharp, like the tension had been vacuum-sealed into the air. Charles Robinson remained standing beside his daughter, his frame calm but unmistakably immovable. He didn't need to raise his voice or flash credentials. He had already made his point. Tracy Bennett stood near the front galley now, arms crossed tightly, her jaw clenched, her eyes darting between the passengers and the cockpit. Captain Laura Sanders remained at the flight deck entrance, headset resting on her shoulders, trying to strike the impossible balance between protecting her crew and managing the fallout from what had clearly gone wrong. Behind them, Gerald Whitman had retreated into the kind of bitter silence men often wear when their power is no longer unquestioned. His wife said nothing. She stared out the window like she wanted to disappear. Across the aisle, Rachel Kim glanced at Leah with quiet respect. It was the look one gives not just to someone who survived something unfair, but to someone who handled it with grace that shamed everyone who hadn't spoken up. Helen Brooks, hands folded neatly in her lap, looked straight ahead, her back tall. No one clapped, no one cheered, but something had shifted. The tone, the temperature, the truth. Charles finally took a breath and turned to Captain Sanders. "What's your next move?" he asked plainly. She paused. "We've been instructed to pause boarding until we receive a formal response from operations leadership. They're aware of who you are and of what just happened." Charles nodded once. "Good. This is about more than my daughter's seat. It's about how many others you've done this to who didn't have someone waiting at the gate." His voice was calm, but it carried the kind of weight that doesn't need volume to command attention. Then, without another word, he turned and walked down the aisle, past the other passengers, past Cynthia Morales, past the rows of quiet observers, and sat down in seat 21D in economy. He didn't need first class. His presence had already elevated the entire plane, and back in seat 2A. Leah slowly unclipped her backpack and placed it under the seat in front of her. She pulled out her water bottle, took a small sip, and opened her journal again. She didn't look back at Tracy. She didn't need to. Her dignity had already walked past that woman and sat down where it belonged. A few minutes passed. Then Cynthia quietly approached her, crouched beside her seat, and placed a small wrapped granola bar on the tray table. "You handled that like a queen," she said softly, with just enough warmth to remind Leah that not everyone had looked away. Leah smiled, just a little. "Thank you," she said. "I almost lost it." Cynthia nodded. "You didn't, and that's what they'll remember." She squeezed Leah's hand gently, then stood and returned to the rear of the cabin. Meanwhile, Rachel Kim leaned across the aisle. "I don't know your name," she said softly, "but you taught us all something today." Leah closed her journal halfway and replied, "Leah. My name's Leah." "Well, Leah," Rachel said, "I hope one day my daughter grows up to have half your composure." Helen Brooks leaned over then, her voice quiet but firm. "Child, let me tell you something. There are two kinds of strength, the kind that pushes back, and the kind that waits just long enough to let the truth do it for you. You've got the second kind. Don't ever lose it." Leah nodded, absorbing the words the way she used to memorize poetry in school. Slow, deliberate, with the understanding that they'd matter more later. Down in row 21, Charles sat still, phone resting screen down on his tray table, hands clasped loosely in his lap. He wasn't angry anymore. He was reflective, tired, maybe, but proud. Not because he had embarrassed anyone or pulled power, but because his daughter had stood her ground with quiet strength. And when the time came, she had trusted him not to fight for her, but to stand beside her. That distinction mattered. He looked up just as the captain returned to the cockpit and radioed the update back to ground control. Word had spread. A Mary West executive staff had been notified. The delay was now official, logged, and under internal review. There would be paperwork. There would be questions. But more importantly, there would be a record. This wouldn't vanish. 10 minutes passed before the boarding door was reopened. A new supervisor stepped in, tall, composed, clipboard in hand. He approached Tracy quietly and exchanged a few short, tense words. She didn't respond aloud, but her body stiffened. Then she stepped out of the galley and disappeared through the front cabin door. Leah watched but didn't react. Her dad had told her once, "Sometimes, people who think they have the most control are the first ones to walk away when real accountability shows up." A few passengers murmured. The overhead chime dinged. The voice of the new boarding agent came through the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We will be resuming our departure shortly. Thank you for your patience." Rachel looked at Leah again. "She's gone, isn't she?" Leah nodded. "I didn't even say a word to her." "You didn't need to," Rachel said. "You stood longer than she ever could have." Leah looked out the window, watching the tarmac crew load the last of the luggage. Her hand drifted back to her journal. "They asked for proof. I gave them presence. They asked for silence. I gave them stillness." She closed the book and leaned back against the headrest. The hard part was over. The flight hadn't taken off yet, but somehow she had already arrived. The aircraft door closed with a quiet thump, sealing in a cabin that no longer felt the same. Everything looked normal. Tray tables up, bags stowed, lights dimming for takeoff. But under the surface, something had shifted. The crew had changed. The air had changed. And so had Leah. In seat 2A. She sat with her seatbelt fastened, hands folded neatly over her journal, as if she were already 20 years old. Her composure hadn't cracked, not when she was humiliated, not when her seat was taken, not even when a grown man mocked her dignity in front of dozens of strangers. But now, with the drama behind her and the engines humming low, her body finally exhaled. Not a sob, not a breakdown, just a long, slow breath. The kind you take after holding yourself together for far too long. She turned her head slightly and looked back down the aisle toward economy. She could see the top of her dad's head from where she sat. He hadn't asked to sit beside her. He didn't demand to be moved. He let her have this victory, not as a prize, but as a moment she earned, and deep down, she knew that was his way of saying, "You did this, not me." In the cockpit, Captain Laura Sanders rechecked the checklist with First Officer Jamal Carter. "You good?" she asked quietly, almost like she didn't want anyone to hear. "Yeah," Jamal said, glancing down the checklist. then back toward the cabin door. "That was a lot," Laura nodded. "She handled it better than we did." "That's the truth," Jamal said. 12 years old, and she had more control than half our crew." Laura looked down at her lap, thinking, "We'll be writing reports for weeks." "Yeah," he said, flipping a switch. "But we won't forget her." Just then, a soft knock came at the cockpit door. Laura opened it slightly, and Charles Robinson stood there, not angry, not demanding, just composed. "Captain," he said, "may I have 30 seconds?" Laura stepped aside. "Of course, sir." He stepped in, lowered his voice. "I'm not here to escalate anything. I want you to know that my daughter is okay. I'm okay. But what happened here today won't be forgotten. Not by her, not by me, and probably not by your passengers." Laura nodded. "I understand." Charles continued. "I didn't ground this flight because I wanted revenge. I grounded it because it's time someone did. Time someone said enough. My daughter did that without shouting. You saw it?" Jamal nodded. "We all saw it." Charles placed a hand on the doorframe. "Don't cover for your team. Don't protect what failed. Fix it." And with that, he turned, walked down the aisle, and sat back in 21D like he was just another traveler on just another plane. Back in first class. A quiet chime signaled the beginning of taxi. A new lead flight attendant, a young woman named Melissa, had taken over Tracy's position. She was visibly nervous but professional, moving with a calm urgency, doing everything by the book. When she stopped at Leah's row, she didn't say much, just a soft, "Would you like anything to drink, miss?" Leah looked up, nodded politely. "Water, please." The attendant brought it right away, with 2 lemon slices and a napkin folded just so. Leah said thank you, not because she was impressed, but because she believed grace shouldn't be situational. Behind her, a few passengers shifted in their seats, glancing forward now and then, maybe wondering how the rest of the flight would unfold, maybe just uncomfortable with what they'd witnessed. Gerald Whitman hadn't moved much. He stared out the window, arms crossed, still wearing the expression of a man who was used to being right and now didn't quite know what to do with himself. His wife sat silently beside him, thumbing her ring. Leah took a sip of her water, then looked out her own window. The sun had shifted. Shadows from the terminal stretched long across the tarmac, and for a moment, the airport outside looked quiet, peaceful. But inside her mind, everything from the last hour replayed. Not just the words, but the faces. The way Tracy's voice tightened when she saw her. The way no one spoke up. The way Rachel and Helen finally did. The way her father walked on board like he had every right to protect her. Not because of his title, but because of her worth. She thought of something he said once, years ago, when she asked him why he never yelled in meetings. "Because people remember calm," he'd said. "And calm doesn't mean weak. It means you already know the truth, and you're not afraid of its silence." That's what she'd carried today. Not volume, not rage, just truth, steady and unshakable. As the plane rolled toward the runway, Leah opened her notebook one last time. She wrote carefully, deliberately. "The flight didn't leave on time, but I did. I left their doubt behind me." She smiled faintly, then closed the book and tucked it under her arm. She didn't need to write the rest. She was living it. The wheels lifted off the ground minutes later. Newark fell away beneath them, and somewhere between the runway and the clouds, a girl who had been told she didn't belong took flight. Not just in her seat, but in who she was, and in first class. For the first time that morning, she truly felt like she was where she was meant to be. Somewhere at 33,000 feet, as the plane settled into smooth cruise above the clouds. The tension that had filled the cabin earlier began to soften, not vanish, but change shape. It no longer hovered like smoke. It settled more like memory. In seat 2A, Leah Robinson leaned back against the headrest, eyes open but unfocused. Not reading, not writing, just thinking. Her window framed nothing but sky, but in her mind, she replayed the entire morning in silent flashes. The tone in that woman's voice, the weight of everyone watching her stand, the quiet heat in her chest when her father stepped onto the plane. She hadn't cried. Not once. Not when they doubted her. Not when they forced her to move. Not even when she saw the look on her father's face. Not angry, but hurt. Like something old had opened again inside him. She felt it too. It wasn't new. It was inherited. But for the first time, she realized it didn't control her. She had held her ground. And now, up here in the quiet sky, she was learning how to breathe through the stillness that came after standing tall for too long. Across the aisle, Rachel Kim finally unbuckled her seatbelt and leaned toward Leah, resting her arm gently on the edge of her tray table. "You doing all right?" she asked, her voice soft. Leah nodded once. "I think so." Rachel gave a small smile. "That's more than most people could say after a morning like that." Leah blinked, then replied, "It's weird. I'm not mad. I'm just tired. Like, deep tired." Rachel nodded slowly. "That's not weird. That's what strength feels like after it's been tested." She paused, then said, "I'm glad you didn't yell. Not because it would have been wrong, but because they expect that you gave them something they didn't expect. Grace." Leah didn't answer right away. Then, after a beat, she said, "My dad says calm makes people listen longer." Rachel nodded. "He sounds like a good man." Leah looked toward the back of the plane. "He is." In row 21D, Charles Robinson sat quietly, knees slightly turned toward the aisle, headphones unplugged in his lap, his phone screen dark. He wasn't sleeping. He was watching, thinking, not about the business fallout or the press calls that would surely follow, but about Leah, about how, at 12 years old, she had already faced something most grown men would fold under: public humiliation, prejudice wrapped in professionalism, and silence from people who should have known better. And she had endured it without losing herself. He felt pride, of course. But beneath that, he also felt sorrow. Because he knew, from his own childhood, from decades of boardrooms and private airports and veiled comments in conference calls, that Leah's experience wasn't isolated. It was patterned, familiar, and now, passed down. But maybe, just maybe, she would carry it differently than he did. Maybe she already was. Back in first class, Helen Brooks stood gently and walked up the aisle. Melissa, the new flight attendant, offered her an arm as she steadied herself. Helen made her way to Leah's row and crouched slightly beside her seat, knees crackling but heart steady. "Miss Leah," she said warmly, "I just wanted to tell you something, if that's all right." Leah looked over, surprised. "Of course," she said. Helen took a breath. "When I was about your age, in 1955, I saw a little black girl turned away from a lunch counter. I didn't say a word. I just watched. I told myself it wasn't my fight. But I never forgot her face. I think I saw it again today. Only this time. She looked stronger." Leah looked at her, eyes wide. "That wasn't your fault," she said softly. "No, it wasn't," Helen replied. "But silence still leaves a mark, and I didn't want to leave another one today." Leah reached out her hand, and Helen took it. They didn't say anything else. After meal service, The cabin dimmed slightly. Most passengers tucked into books or closed their eyes, but Leah stayed awake. She opened her journal again, not to write about what happened, but to draw. She wasn't the best artist, but she liked how pencil lines made emotions feel smaller, manageable. She sketched 2 plain windows side by side. In one, a small girl stood alone. In the other, the same girl sat tall, with sunlight on her face. She looked at the drawing for a while, then tore the page out, folded it neatly, and tucked it into her father's briefcase the next time he walked past her seat. She didn't say anything. He didn't ask. Later, after landing, he would find it, and when he did, he'd know exactly what it meant. As the flight neared descent, the captain made an announcement thanking passengers for their patience. No one mentioned the delay. No one mentioned the early conflict, but everyone knew. Gerald Whitman hadn't spoken since takeoff. He hadn't apologized. He probably never would, but he had been quiet. And in that quiet, something in him had shifted. Not much, not enough, but something. His wife had noticed. So had everyone else. Leah closed her eyes for the first time since they left Newark. Not to sleep, but to rest. Truly rest. She didn't need her dad beside her in that moment. She didn't need a speech or a viral video or a banner across the aisle declaring her victory. What she needed was this, the silence of knowing she had stayed herself, completely, through it all, that she hadn't let their doubts rewrite her identity, and that was worth more than any first-class ticket. A week later, Leah Robinson stood at the front of her school auditorium, wearing a navy blue dress and a silver pin shaped like an open book. It was Youth Voices Week, a tradition at Pine Brook Middle School, where one student from each grade was chosen to read something they'd written, something that mattered. Leah hadn't planned on writing about the flight. At first, she thought she'd write about her favorite novel or her grandmother's Sunday peach cobbler. But something changed the moment she sat back down in 2A. The moment she felt the hum of the plane beneath her and realized she had just gone through something much bigger than a bad experience. She had stood for more than herself. And now, it was time to speak. As she stepped up to the microphone, the room grew quiet. Her father sat in the back row, arms folded gently across his chest. Not as a CEO, not even as a father, but as a man who had once stood in the same silence and never had the chance to speak. Leah adjusted the mic slightly, looked out over the sea of classmates and teachers, and began to read. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw a fit. I didn't demand anything. I stood quietly when they told me I didn't belong. I waited while they questioned whether my name matched my seat. I watched grown-ups measure my worth by my shoes and my skin. And I stood, not because I wanted to, but because I refused to disappear. I didn't defend my seat because it was expensive. I defended it because it was mine, because my dad worked for it, because I showed my ticket, followed the rules, and did everything they asked. And still, they looked at me and saw a question mark instead of a person. But here's the thing. I didn't sit down when they told me to. I sat down when I was ready. I sat down after the truth showed up, and I stayed quiet long enough for it to get loud on its own. There was no applause at first, just a long, thick silence. The kind that lets words settle, not bounce off the walls. Then slowly, a wave of claps rose from the middle rows, moved to the sides, and then filled the room until even the janitor in the back wiped at his eye. Charles didn't clap. He just sat back and smiled. The kind of smile that stretches through generations. The kind that says, "You did it better than I ever could." After the event, teachers and students came up to Leah with hugs, questions, even thank yous. But she didn't linger. She wanted to go home. She wanted to breathe again, in the car. Her dad didn't say anything for a few blocks. Then, quietly, he asked, "What made you decide to write about it?" Leah looked out the window, then down at her lap. "Because they tried to make me smaller," she said, "and writing it made me whole again." He nodded. That's exactly what it did. The following day, Pinebrook School District Superintendent called, so did a local news station. Then Ameriwest Airlines released a public statement acknowledging a regrettable incident involving a minor passenger and announced the creation of a new training module, one developed in partnership with Robinson Aerospace, focused on implicit bias, respectful service, and traveler dignity. They didn't name Leah. They didn't need to. Everyone already knew. Within a month. Ameriwest launched a protocol change for solo youth travelers, clearer ID processes, no forced removal unless accompanied by law enforcement, and staff evaluations tied to equity performance internally. Some employees resisted, others welcomed the shift. Either way, the change had started, not through protest or lawsuit, but through presence, quiet, unwavering presence. Leah didn't chase the attention. She didn't do interviews or post on social media. She returned to 7th grade like nothing had changed. But something had. Not just in how others saw her, but in how she carried herself. Her classmates noticed. Her teachers did. Too. Not because she was louder, but because she was lighter. One afternoon, in English class, her teacher assigned a personal essay on courage. A boy in the back raised his hand and asked, "Can we write about someone else?" The teacher nodded. "As long as they inspired you." The boy pointed at Leah and said, "I want to write about her." She didn't say anything, just smiled and opened her notebook. On the final page of that notebook, she wrote one last entry. It wasn't long. Just a few lines. They thought I was standing still, but I was rising. They thought I was alone, but I carried generations with me. They thought they grounded me, but I was already flying. She closed the book and placed it on her shelf next to a worn copy of Maya Angelou's Still I Rise and a photograph of her and her dad from her first flight at age 5. She didn't know what would come next, what her next test would be, or who might try again to doubt her place. But she knew what she'd do. She'd take a breath, stand up, speak if needed, and sit only when she was ready. If this story meant something to you, please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, truly, and until next time, stay kind, stay aware, and never stop standing for what's right.